much about the regulatory process as the rest of the folks in this building combined. And we really need to take out our touchpads and take some notes today. And there are many ways to introduce Glen Robinson. There are a couple of wonderful tributes that his colleagues at the University of Virginia Law School have penned that are on our website here at George Mason, just to give you a bit of a flavor. And a scholar who could not be here today, but is somebody who ought to know a little bit about Glen Robinson. A colleague and co-author of mine named Dennis Weissman is an economist, professor of economics at Kansas State University. And he's one of the legion of Glen Robinson fans, and he volunteered. He could not get here from the Midwest today, but he volunteered to write an introduction I want to share with you. Dennis says, almost a quarter century ago, I was only a few years out of graduate school and eager to set the academic world straight on telecom policy. My readings had led me to conclude that Professor Glen Robinson was the most able of scholars. So I sent him a manuscript out of the blue that purported to show where the FCC had erred with its policy prescription to accommodate the transition to competition in telecommunications markets. 2 weeks later, a rather large envelope arrived in the mail, postmarked University of Virginia School of Law. I anxiously opened the letter, certain that Professor Robinson would recognize the brilliance of my manuscript and the important role it would play in policy circles. I am confident that in those 5 single-spaced pages Professor Robinson sent me that day, there must have been at least one kind word about my manuscript. But for the life of me, I can't remember what it was. The last 2 sentences in the letter pretty much summed it up. This has been a long and rather contentious response to your invitation for comments. As in eating potato chips, I could not stop with one bite. I suppose that crestfallen is the only term that accurately described my feelings that day. And yet, in the days that followed, I reread Professor Robinson's letter many times. And I began to recognize that amidst his criticism was a profoundly important lesson about how to write an academic paper. 2 weeks after that letter arrived, I was scheduled to make a presentation at a conference in Washington, D.C., divestiture 5 years later. Much to my chagrin, Professor Robinson was on the same program. And as luck would have it, when I arrived at the conference to register, Professor Robinson was the very first person I met. The gentleman I met that day at the conference was one of the warmest, most genuine, and endearing individuals that I have ever encountered. A far cry from the troll-like creature with sharp claws and a leathery hide that I imagined had written the letter. We spoke frequently at the conference, and in the months that followed, he strongly encouraged me to rewrite my paper, patiently tutored me on how to develop the main points in a compelling analytical way, and my manuscript slowly began to take shape. A few months after that, the Federal Communications Law Journal accepted the manuscript for publication. In the course of my ordeal, an exercise in creative destruction, if there ever was one, I had unwittingly become one of those countless fortunate souls educated at the hand of the venerable Professor Robinson. I would never be the same. Glen and I kept in touch on and off throughout the years. He would continue to comment on my manuscripts, and I would continue to reap the benefits of his quick wit, scholarly insights, and penetrating intellect. You see, Glen Robinson is not your typical professor. Both broadly and deeply knowledgeable, his writing is a magical blend of analytics, logic, and poetry. How often does the Supreme Court of the United States cite a book review in one of its decisions? In today's academic world, where professors tend to specialize in increasingly narrow fields of inquiry, Glen Robinson is the exception to the rule. Always the scholar, never the technician, reciting his accomplishments and the significance of his writings would easily exhaust the time allocated for his lecture this afternoon, so a brief trek through the highlights must suffice. He got a bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1958, a JD from Stanford in 1961. He was an FCC commissioner in 74 to 76, U.S. ambassador and head of the delegation to the World Administrative Radio Conference, author of 5 books and numerous scholarly articles on torts, property. I got you mixed up with the Posner introduction, sorry. Intellectual property, antitrust regulation, medical malpractice, and legal education. One of the nation's foremost authorities on administrative law, and congressional and court testimony on communications and regulation policy. 4 years ago, I worked with Glen on an essential facilities proceeding in Canada before the Canadian regulator CRTC. As is typical in such proceedings, the issues are largely won and lost in the cross-examination phase. I had the, quote, good fortune, unquote, to sit on an expert witness panel with Professor Robinson. Corinne, I was in charge of keeping his water glass filled. Corinne. I placed the term, quote, good fortune, unquote, in quotation marks for a reason. You see, the smart lawyers understood that it would be foolhardy to cross-examine Glen, for they knew they would only embarrass themselves. Since they had to ask questions of someone, I was the unfortunate target. And yet, much like the farm club ace who was certain that he can get his fastball past Babe Ruth, there were a few overconfident attorneys who thought they could get the better of Professor Robinson on cross-examination anyway. The briefs in the CRTC proceeding are an enduring testament to their failure. Over the past few years, I've co-authored 2 articles with Glen, certainly one of the true highlights of my career. But even now, more than 2 decades after our chance encounter, when I finished the draft of a manuscript and sent it off to him, I feel the same twinge of anxiety that I experienced in graduate school when turning in one of my final exams. Because for me, Glen Robinson will always be the master teacher and scholar, and I will always be the student desperately trying to prove that the time he had invested in me was not in vain. So as you sit back and listen to the lecture this afternoon, know that you are in the presence of greatness, for Professor Robinson is of that rare breed, not just a scholar, but a scholar's scholar. So that's from Professor Dennis Weissman, and we thank Dennis for that, and I thank our speaker today, Professor Glen O. Robinson.
The introduction reminds me of a comment that I heard from Paul Sanderson, who was, after receiving a very enthusiastic introduction, he mumbled, "These things are not said under oath." But it's a pleasure as well as an honor to be here, be a part of the Big Ideas series. When Tom first contacted me, I must say I had to scratch my head about what kind of big ideas I might come up with. Notwithstanding our introduction, I actually don't have a lot of big ideas, but I have a few observations to share with you. This year, we celebrate the centennial of electronic communications regulation. Well, celebrate might not be the right word. Critics would probably insist that lamentations is the proper description. Let me finesse that question for now as to whether it's celebration or lamentations. I'm simply saying that after a century of regulation, it's time to take stock, to look back and see what we have learned. And when I thought about that task, what have we learned, I thought immediately, well, I'll just start out by reviewing the whole history of communications regulation. And we'll see. And I quickly put that task behind as hopeless. A lecture of that kind would require a lecture too long to be tolerated anywhere outside the UN General Assembly. So I decided to take seriously the idea of big ideas and offer a few. And it seemed best to put these in the context of stories. Now, there are hundreds of stories to be told about this century of regulation. So again, since this is not the UN, I had to be selective. And I chose 3. Before beginning to explore those 3 lessons, those 3 stories rather, I probably ought to explain further the reference to the 100-year history. Because sort of the conventional take on a conventional reference point for communications regulatory history is to begin with 1934, when the Communications Act was enacted and the FCC was created to administer. But the 1934 Act was substantively unoriginal. It basically just melded together 2 previously existing regimes. One, a regime for regulating telephone and telegraph carriers, and the other one for regulating radio users. The first of those goes back to 1910, hence the centennial. The second goes back to 1927, the Radio Act of 1927. In 1934, these two regimes were mushed together, and that's about the right way to put it. There wasn't really any real integration. They were just thrown together in the same institutional framework. The FCC, which was a slight makeover of the Federal Radio Commission, was created to administer it. Now, tracing the origins back all the way to 1910 might seem to stretch the regulatory history a little bit, because we actually go back to those days when the Interstate Commerce Commission had jurisdiction. There wasn't much to report. There really wasn't much regulation. But that's true of many government programs. They begin as kind of tiny little streams, and then they grow by accretion until they become mighty Mississippis of energy and activity. And that's exactly what's happening with communications regulation in 100 years since the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910. My first story in this running stream of regulation is a story about the construction of regulatory paradigms. Most specifically, it's about the rise and fall of the natural monopoly paradigm model in telecommunications regulation. My second story is actually a couple of stories, both of which illustrate a distinctive characteristic of regulation, namely its self-defining quality. The story opens with the early evolution of cable television regulation 45 years ago, but it finds a more recent replication in the current controversy over regulating internet broadband providers on the matter of network neutrality. My third story is about symbolism. Symbols don't receive a lot of attention from regulatory scholars. The interest group for public choice theorists usually give it short shrift, and do not allow much room for it as a driver of regulation. But communications law is actually quite fertile source of symbols, because it is inherently about the way in which ideas, including symbols, are conveyed. The values, therefore, that adhere in the message easily and naturally find their way into the medium through which the message is conveyed. You can find a lot of symbols in media policies, but the one I want to discuss has, over the years, dominated most of the others, and it's the idea of localism. My first story about the rise and fall of the natural monopoly model in telecommunications law is the intellectual history portion, or at least part of the intellectual history portion, of a remarkable larger story of social and economic change. In the early era of telecommunications, following the expiration of Bell patents, there was a period, roughly 20-year period, of vigorous competition between the Bell system and the independent carriers, the independent industry. It did not survive for a variety of reasons, including some very aggressive competitive tactics by AT&T, such as refusal to interconnect with the independents, refusal to sell equipment, and an aggressive program of acquisitions. This was partly halted by an antitrust action filed in 1913 by the Justice Department, which led to a so-called Kingsbury Commitment later in that same year, by which AT&T agreed to interconnect at least its long-distance network with the independent carriers, and to also submit to the Justice Department for approval any acquisition of competing carriers. These commitments might have preserved the independent industry. They did not, in fact, preserve competition. In fact, the Justice Department routinely approved all the acquisitions, particularly acquisitions of competing carriers in the same market, oftentimes by making a swap, that is to say, leaving the independents a monopoly in one market, leaving AT&T a monopoly in the other. So, although we had an independent industry, we really didn't have competition. Later, in 1921, the original ban on acquisitions was terminated in favor of submitting all these to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which again routinely approved all these acquisitions. That year, 1921, is often cited as the end of the competitive era. In the end, what proved fatal to competition was less a matter of AT&T